I'm Katie Sewell, and this is A Bittersweet Moment with Tiffany Parks.
Hello and welcome to the Bittersweet Life. I'm Tiffany Parks, and this is your midweek Halloween Bittersweet Moment. So happy Halloween in advance, everyone. And today I thought, instead of talking about one of Rome's many amazing sights, I thought I'd tell a ghost story. Now, this story happened to my husband. I tried to get him to come on here and tell the story himself, but he's very shy, as you may have noticed, because 12 years in on this podcast, he has still, as far as I know, as far as I can remember, he has still never appeared. So you're going to have to make do with me retelling his story, and I sincerely hope that I get it right. But one thing to know before I start this story is that Claudio is not the kind of person to assume that a strange happening is ghost related. Claudio is a very practical person. His feet are pretty well grounded on terra firma, and he doesn't really go in for the kind of, let's say, magical thinking, for lack of a better expression. He's pretty down to earth, and he's the type of person who tends to think that there are scientific, or at the very least rational, explanations for pretty much anything that happens. And I say that because I think that makes the story more interesting and more believable, frankly. Because if this had happened to someone else, I might not fully believe that it was ghost related, which I got to say I do. I really do believe that. So he's not even convinced, but he definitely thinks something strange was going on. So without further ado, Claudio's ghost story. This happened when Claudio was about 18 years old, and it happened in the town of Ilica in the region of Lazio, where Rome is. Now, this town, if you look up Ilica on Google, first of all, if you look it up, the town is not the first thing that's going to appear. There are several other things that relate to the term Ilica until you finally get to the town. The town is so small. It's almost a suburb of another small town. That's how tiny it is. If you look it up on Wikipedia, you will find that there are only 4 residents in the entire town of Ilica. Now, those 4 residents are year-round residents. But during holidays, particularly at Christmas, Easter, and in the summer, there are a few more people in the town. So it's the kind of town in which it would have been always a small town. It was never anything more than a small town, but it would have had probably a couple of hundred residents, maybe 1,000 residents at one time. And slowly over the years, because of the lack of work, people have left. And the city has dwindled down to literally 4 residents. It's one of what they call Italy's dying cities, or Italy's ghost cities, which makes it particularly apt to have a ghost story take place in it. So at Easter, people who are originally from Ilica, or maybe their parents or grandparents were originally from there, and they probably never lived there, but they might have a family home there, they will go for the holidays and sort of reunite there. So this story takes place in Easter of around the year 1998. There were probably, according to my husband, about 30 people in the town at that time because it was Easter time. It was also a very, very cold Easter, unseasonably cold. That's not that uncommon in the mountainous regions around Lazio. You think of Rome, you think it's really warm, it's always hot, you've got the Mediterranean climate. But if you go up into the mountains, even not very tall mountains, you will find that the temperature absolutely drops and there is a cold northern breeze called the tramontana, which, if you've ever experienced the tramontana, it is a bitterly cold wind. It is a mountain wind that can make pretty decently mild temperatures seem absolutely frigid. So it was a very, very cold Easter. Claudio was in Ilica with his friend Riccardo, whose grandparents originally came from Ilica, and he and his parents and his grandparents and his siblings were going to be in Ilica for the Easter holidays, and Riccardo invited Claudio to come along with him. The two young men decided to take a walk, an evening walk. It was already dark by this time. It was probably after dinner. And Claudio, what he wants to impress upon me when he tells this story is just how cold it was, despite being Easter. They were each wearing a big, thick, warm jacket, scarves, and hats. And they were still cold. Now, before you start saying Italians can't handle the cold, look, I'm not going to argue with you. It's true. But it was truly a cold night. The kind of night that you do not want to be out walking around in light clothing. So the two of them were walking around this town. Now, I want to just remind you how small the town is. Lots of buildings had been abandoned because so many people, so many families had moved away. Shop after shop had closed. I'm pretty sure there are no restaurants in the town anymore, even at that time. So there were a lot of buildings that were completely abandoned. Also, the people that were in the town, they all knew each other. It's impossible in a town of 4 people, which might swell to 30 or 40 during the holidays, that they wouldn't all know each other. So Riccardo, who, like I said, his grandparents were from there, he knew everybody in the town and everybody who happened to be there for the Easter holidays. His mother was arriving a little bit later than the rest of his family. He had showed up with his father earlier in the day, and his mother arrived that evening. And as they were taking their walk in this tiny town, they heard their mother's car arriving at Grandma's house. And she immediately started calling to them to come home. She was probably, like a good Italian mama, worried that they were going to be getting cold. So she started calling for Riccardo and for Claudio, and they heard her voice, and they started immediately heading home. It was too cold to be out anyway. As they were walking home, rather in a hurry, in this dark, unlit, abandoned town, they were hurrying down a little street, and as they passed by a very, very narrow alley, an alley that can't even really be described as an alley, a space between two buildings that you could do nothing more than walk down, just extremely, extremely narrow alleyway. As they passed this alleyway, they both noticed, sort of out of their peripheral vision, a person standing in the alleyway. And they both look to their right, and they both notice a young woman, all dressed in white. Not only was she dressed in white, she was in a white dress, and she had on no coat, no sweater, no hat, no scarf. Her shoulders and upper chest were bare, as were her arms. In that moment, they didn't really stop and think about it. They were in a hurry to get home. They were cold. Mama was calling. And so they just hurried on. They eventually got home, got inside, warmed up by the fire, and then they sort of turned to each other after a few moments. And Claudio said to Riccardo, "Did you see that woman? Did you see that girl?" And Riccardo said, Yeah, I saw her. The one in the alley. Yeah, she was dressed in a white dress." And they began to talk about it. And they began to think about it. And they realized how strange it seemed to them for a woman to be out on a night like that in a white dress and nothing else, without being bundled up. What was she doing? What was she out for in this tiny, tiny little town that has no pubs, no nightclubs, no restaurants, no young people, except the very few people that they know who are already there. They asked their parents, is anybody in town that we don't know? Because Ricardo, having gone to that town every Easter and every summer for his entire life, knew everybody, knew all the cousins or random relatives he would see there. And he didn't recognize this girl. So he asked his mom, is anyone else in the town? No, it's just us. It's just the people that we know. So who was this girl? They decided to go back the next day to the spot where they saw this vision. And what they discovered that they hadn't noticed on the night before was that alleyway was completely chained shut. There was a gate and a huge chain wrapped around the gate and a lock. And not only that, but the lock was completely rusted. The buildings attached to this alleyway had long since been abandoned. Nobody lived there. The alleyway didn't lead anywhere. And it was locked. And there was no way anyone could have passed through there for years, for decades, if not longer. Claudio and Ricardo both say to this day that if it hadn't been for the fact that they both saw this woman and they both saw exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, they would not have believed their own eyes. Claudio said that if he hadn't been with Ricardo, he would just assume that his impression was mistaken, that he was seeing things, that there was some optical illusion. But Ricardo saw the very same thing. They've never been able to come up with any kind of rational explanation for what they saw. But it's also interesting that in the year 2016, there was a devastating earthquake in the area where this town is that destroyed, most famously, the town of Amatrice, which is famous for the pasta that's named after it. The town of Ilica was also completely destroyed, and that town no longer exists.
Cappuccino assassino, ballerina, cappuccino, bomberini, cozzini, hippopotamo, troppo trippica, topping, lavanica, saturnica,